Today, we're doing a deep dive into that tragic mid-air collision.
That happened just yesterday.
Yeah, January 29th, 2025,
Mm.
near Reagan National Airport, American Airlines Flight 5342. It was a Bombardier CRJ-700, and it collided with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter.
A truly awful tragedy. 67 lives were lost, which makes this the deadliest U.S. aviation incident since, well, 2001.
And it's a really stark reminder, I think, that even with all the advanced technology we have and all the rigorous regulations, air travel still has some inherent risks. We want to go beyond those headlines, though, beyond that initial shock. We want to try and understand not just what happened, but why.
That's the most important thing, getting to the why.
Right. So we've got investigative reports, firsthand accounts, and even a pretty deep dive into the history of helicopter regulations, particularly around DCA.
Our goal is to try to piece together those factors that contributed to this, to understand why this happened. We'll look at systemic issues, obviously.
Yeah.
We'll look at pilot decisions, the possibility of human error, because ultimately, this is about all of us becoming more informed travelers, maybe even more informed citizens.
Okay, let's unpack what we actually know so far about what happened. Flight 5342 was on just a typical landing approach. They were descending towards the runway.
Routine flight.
Yeah. And at the same time, we had the Black Hawk helicopter, and they were transitioning between some standard helicopter routes, which is actually a common occurrence in that airspace.
Right. I mean, it happens all the time.
But now, early reports, and it's really important to stress that these are preliminary, suggest that the Black Hawk might have been above its 200-foot altitude limit.
Yeah, I saw those reports too. But it's really crucial, like you said, to avoid jumping to conclusions. The data from the black boxes is still being analyzed, and I think that data is going to paint a much, much clearer picture of what actually happened in those final moments.
Absolutely. And this wasn't an isolated incident at DCA either.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what makes this so unsettling. There have been some other close calls that have been reported.
Oh, yeah.
Including one just 24 hours before this crash. It was another regional jet and a military helicopter that came dangerously close to colliding.
Wow. So that's significant, I think. When you see a pattern of near misses, it very often points to some underlying vulnerabilities in an airspace's, design or procedures.
Yeah.
And, DCA, as you might know, it's notoriously challenging for pilots. I mean, its location.
Yeah.
Right in the heart of Washington, D.C., surrounded by all these government buildings, all this restricted airspace.
You can't fly over the White House, the Capitol, all these places.
Exactly. It means pilots have to navigate this incredibly complex web of commercial flights, military aircraft, and even, presidential movements.
Yeah, I mean, it really is like trying to thread a needle while juggling chainsaws, which, it makes you wonder, could another airport have been a safer choice? I mean, for either aircraft involved, what factors actually go into deciding which airport a flight uses?
That's a really interesting question, and the answer is not simple. These decisions about airport usage are really complex. You're trying to balance operational efficiency with all these factors like runway capacity, airline hubs, and, let's be honest, even political considerations come into play sometimes.
Absolutely. Let's maybe zoom in on helicopters specifically now and their kind of relationship to DCA.
Yeah.
They're obviously vital for government and military operations. I mean, we're talking about the Capitol here.
Yeah.
But their presence near DCA has raised concerns really for years.
Yeah. Essential, yes, but not without some controversy.
Right.
We did some research on the history of helicopter regulations under the FAA. And it's fascinating to see how they've evolved over the decades. It goes all the way back to, believe it or not, the 1950s. And it was heavily influenced by events like the Korean War and the Vietnam War.
So imagine it's the 1950s, right? Helicopters are just proving themselves in combat. The Pentagon is investing heavily in these, versatile machines. But TFPT, the FAA, is really scrambling to figure out how to safely integrate these whirling contraptions into the existing airspace. And the early guidelines were actually adapted from, get this, fixed-wing regulations.
Yeah, well, that doesn't sound like a perfect fit. Like trying to apply the rules of the road to a flock of birds. The fundamental differences in how helicopters operate, it really demanded a whole new set of considerations.
Exactly. And even back then, DCA was a busy hub, and those early helicopter operations, particularly around the Pentagon, actually prompted the creation of dedicated flight paths. Rudimentary, sure, but it was a start.
Yeah, those early efforts kind of laid the foundation for what we have today, that more sophisticated, multi-layered regulatory framework. But looking back at those early days, it really highlights that inherent tension that's always existed between the unique capabilities of helicopters and the need to ensure safety in a very crowded airspace.
And I think that tension is at the heart of what we're exploring today. So we've got these early helicopters trying to kind of, find their place in the sky. But the world is changing rapidly around them. Technology, it's advancing. The role of the helicopter is expanding. And the FAA is constantly trying to adapt and to keep pace with all of these changes.
It was a busy time for them.
Yeah. So let's move into the 1960s. This is actually when the FAA officially comes into being, solidifying their authority over everything aviation. And guess what really kind of puts helicopters center stage here?
Vietnam.
Yeah, the Vietnam War.
Yeah, absolutely. The Vietnam War was a real turning point for helicopters. I mean, their role in troop transport, medevac missions, search and rescue, you name it, it really forced the FAA to completely refine airworthiness standards, training protocols, everything.
It's fascinating how these major historical events, actually end up shaping these seemingly, technical aspects of aviation. Like the need for rapid deployment, the need for tactical advantage in a war zone. It really drove innovations in both helicopter technology and the rules governing their use.
Yeah, and those lessons learned in combat zones often end up having ripple effects on civilian aviation too, especially when it comes to safety.
Right. Back in the U.S., the Pentagon is starting to rely more and more on helicopters to shuttle VIPs between, the Pentagon and nearby installations.
Of course, yeah. Fast, secure transport for high-ranking officials is, it's essential. But that need had to be balanced with, well, the already complex airspace around Washington, D.C.
So we've got this evolving technology, an increasingly vital role for these helicopters, in both the civilian and military spheres, and an already crowded and complex airspace around the nation's capital.
Yeah, it really was kind of a recipe for a potential disaster if it wasn't managed very carefully.
Right.
And that's, I think, precisely why the history of these regulations is so important to understand how we arrived at this point. Moving it to the 1970s, you really see a renewed focus on safety. Fresh off the lessons of Vietnam, the Pentagon in particular was setting some very stringent standards for new helicopter models. One of those models was the UH-60 Black Hawk, which actually entered development late in that decade.
Oh, wow. So that's the same type of Black Hawk that was actually involved in the crash that we're talking about today.
Precisely. And this is where it gets interesting, I think. The 70s also saw this huge surge in environmental awareness. Noise complaints from all the communities near these airports and military bases, those were on the rise.
That makes sense. I mean, helicopters aren't exactly known for being, quiet.
Right. So the FAA they had to respond. They introduced these stricter noise abatement requirements, which really forced adjustments to the helicopter routes around DCA and the Pentagon. It was a real balancing act, trying to meet these operational needs while also minimizing, the disruption to communities on the ground.
Right. So it wasn't just about preventing like collisions up in the air. It was also about this noise pollution down on the ground. It's multiple layers of complexity even back then.
Yeah.
And remember, this is all happening as helicopters themselves are becoming more sophisticated.
Exactly. Advanced navigation systems, autopilot capabilities, all of that. It really pushed the FAA to revise their regulations governing things like instrument flight, minimum flight altitudes, you name it.
It sounds like a little bit of a regulatory arms race.
Yeah.
Technology pushing the boundaries and the FAA just kind of trying to keep up.
In a sense, yes. And it wasn't just the FAA either. The Pentagon, with their increasingly specialized helicopter roles, I mean, things like search and rescue, anti-submarine warfare, all of it, it broadened the scope of what regulators had to consider.
Yeah.
I mean, as helicopters became more and more integral to all these different missions, the rules governing them had to become much more intricate too. So the 1970s, it really marked, I think, this period of regulatory maturation for helicopters.
Interesting. Okay, let's fast forward now to the 1980s. We've got Cold War tensions; those are high.
Yeah.
And that actually had a direct impact on helicopter development.
Absolutely. I mean, the Pentagon, they were really focused on rapid response capabilities, expanding and modernizing their helicopter fleets. And the FAA, of course, had to keep pace.
Regulations always seem to be playing kind of catch up, don't they?
They do, often, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
It's about, making sure that new technologies are implemented safely and responsibly. So in the 80s, they updated regulations to address evolving avionics. early digital flight control systems, for example. And military rotorcraft like the Black Hawk and the AH-64 Apache, those benefited from these new certification standards, which had a strong emphasis on reliability and, crucially, survivability.
Survivability. What exactly does that mean in the context of helicopters?
It's the ability to basically withstand damage and continue operating. So, think about it in a combat scenario, every second counts. A helicopter that can take a hit and keep flying, that could mean the difference between life and death for the crew.
Oh, wow.
And so that focus on survivability, it really influenced design choices, material selection, even maintenance procedures.
Right. So it's not just about preventing accidents in the first place. It's also about, mitigating the consequences if one does happen.
Exactly. And back in D.C., we had the heightened security concerns of the Cold War, so that led to even more complex procedures for flights near any government landmarks, especially the Pentagon.
So even more layers added to that already intricate airspace around DCA. I'm starting to see a bit of a pattern here. Every decade seems to bring new challenges, new technologies, new concerns, and the regulations, they just have to kind of evolve to address all of them.
Yeah, it's this constant process of adaptation and refinement. And it's not just, big picture kind of geopolitical events like the Cold War. The 1980s also saw the rise of these advanced training simulators,
Oh, right.
which were a game changer for pilot training.
Yeah, I can see why. Being able to practice those complex maneuvers, instrument flights, even emergency procedures, all in a safe, controlled environment. That's going to be invaluable for building skills and confidence.
Absolutely. And the Pentagon recognized the value of this technology very quickly, started requiring simulator hours for certain helicopter certifications. And the FAA, they launched campaigns to increase pilot awareness of things like air traffic control protocols and instrument flight rules. So, those efforts, combined with all the advancements in simulator technology, it really helped professionalize helicopter operations overall.
So while all of this is happening, helicopter technology itself continues to evolve at this rapid pace.
Hmm.
New materials, improved engine designs, greater payload capacity, longer range. It's amazing how quickly things were changing.
It was, and the FAA, they had to adapt yet again, refine certification categories, tighten maintenance requirements, and the safety analyses became more data-driven, with the FAA meticulously collecting incident reports to pinpoint recurring problems and, identify potential risks.
So they were really trying to stay ahead of the curve, trying to anticipate these potential issues before they turned into major incidents.
Proactive safety management. It was a crucial shift in their thinking. By the end of the 1980s, we had, I think, a much more sophisticated and robust regulatory framework for helicopters. It was shaped by these technological advancements, Cold War tensions, and that growing recognition of the importance of this proactive safety management.
But the story doesn't end there. The world keeps changing, and helicopter regulations have to change right along with it. The 1990s brought about another kind of wave of changes, this time spurred by, well, a major geopolitical event, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
That's right. And the collapse of the Soviet Union actually had a profound impact on how helicopters were used and therefore on how they were regulated. The Pentagon, they shifted their focus from this, large-scale conflict, potential large-scale conflict, to more regional crises and humanitarian missions. So instead of prepping for, this massive tank battle in Europe, helicopters were increasingly being deployed for things like peacekeeping operations, disaster relief, things like that.
So new missions, new environments, new challenges.
Yeah.
I imagine that that kept the FAO pretty busy.
Oh, they were busy. They had to refine all the rules for international operations, things like overwater flights, coordinating with other countries' airspaces. And then back in D.C., a new concern was emerging: terrorism.
Right.
Yeah. And this kind of specter of terrorism really cast a long shadow over aviation security, particularly in the nation's capital.
That makes sense. After the Cold War, the focus really kind of shifted from those kind of nation-state threats to these more decentralized, unpredictable threats.
Exactly. So we saw, even tighter security around the Pentagon and DCA, stricter identification protocols for all military helicopters, no-fly zones during any presidential movements, all of these things. It just added to the complexity of the airspace.
It's amazing how much I think we take for granted when we board a plane or see a helicopter just flying overhead. There's this whole kind of hidden world of regulations and protocols and all this behind-the-scenes coordination that's happening that really keeps things running smoothly most of the time.
It really is. It's a testament to, I think, the dedication and the expertise of all those people working in aviation, both on the ground and in the air.
Absolutely. And speaking of expertise, let's talk about pilot responsibility for a minute. We can't just focus on these, big picture regulations. Individual decisions made in that cockpit, those are crucial, especially in a complex airspace like DCA.
Oh, 100%. In fact, that's what we're going to delve into next. The world of pre-flight procedures, all those safety considerations, and something that's often overlooked, the dangers of ground operations.
Okay, so this is where things get really granular. We've been looking at this big, sweeping history, but now we're really zooming in on that individual pilot. So what are their responsibilities before they even take off?
Well, think of it like a surgeon, prepping for some complex operation. Every detail matters. So the pilot, they're responsible for ensuring that helicopter is airworthy, which means meticulous inspections, following checklists to the letter.
Absolutely, yeah, no room for error.
Exactly. And it's not just about, knowing all the regulations and the procedures. It's also about recognizing potential human factors that can come into play.
So things like fatigue, stress, communication issues, these can affect anyone, even the most experienced professionals.
Precisely. Was pilot fatigue a factor in the DCA collision?
Yeah.
Could communication breakdowns have played a role? These are the questions that investigators are going to be asking.
Yeah.
And those answers, those could hold really valuable lessons for preventing similar tragedies.
So we've got this incredibly complex web of regulations, of evolving technologies, and then that ever-present human factor. And it all kind of comes together in that really critical moment when a pilot, takes to the skies. We spent, a good amount of time looking back at this, tracing the evolution of those helicopter regulations and the growing complexity of the airspace, particularly around places like DCA. But let's turn our attention to the present now, the immediate aftermath of this tragedy, and the questions that it raises for the future. So what happened after the crash?
Well, obviously, the immediate aftermath, everyone was really focused on those search and rescue efforts. Boats, divers, all deployed to the Potomac River where the wreckage went down. And sadly, there were no survivors.
Yeah. And the recovery operation, that was a massive undertaking,
Yeah.
involving multiple agencies working around the clock. They had to contend with, frigid water temperatures, strong currents, the fact that the wreckage was completely submerged. It was just a grim and a painstaking process.
Yeah. Really heartbreaking, especially for all the families of the victims who are, just waiting for news, clinging to hope. And speaking of the victims, we should take a moment to remember those who lost their lives.
Absolutely. Among the passengers on Flight 5342 were members of the Skating Club of Boston, returning from a development camp. It's a devastating loss for the figure skating community. Such a loss of, young talent and potential. The victims also included a group of hunters. They were heading home, families returning from trips, even a flight attendant who was actually following in her father's footsteps in the aviation industry.
Yeah. The ripple effects of a tragedy like this are immense. Touch countless lives across the country and beyond. And we can't forget, obviously, the 3 soldiers who were on board in the Black Hawk. Their lives cut short, in the line of duty. I think, each life lost represents a story unfinished, a future unlived.
Absolutely. And as investigators, sift through all the wreckage, both literally and figuratively, they're going to be focusing on a number of key questions. The altitude of the Blackhawks, that's going to be a central point of scrutiny. Was it flying above its designated limit? And if so, why?
Right. They'll also be analyzing the communication between the 2 aircraft, as well as, their interactions with air traffic control. Was there some kind of miscommunication, a missed warning, a breakdown in protocol?
And then there's the question of pilot training, and experience. Were both crews adequately prepared to be operating in, such a complex and demanding airspace?
Yeah.
Could simulator training have, maybe better prepared them for this specific scenario?
Yeah, tough questions. And the answers may not be easy to come by.
But they are crucial questions to ask if we want to learn from this and prevent these future accidents, because ultimately that's what this is all about. It's about preventing another tragedy like this from happening again. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, the FAA implemented, some new restrictions on all those helicopter flights near DCA. It's a very kind of common response. It's a way to quickly, mitigate risk while the investigation's ongoing. But it does raise the question, are these, kind of emergency patches really enough? Or do we need some more comprehensive long-term solutions to address these inherent complexities of, an airspace like DCA?
That's a debate, I think, that is going to, really heat up in the coming weeks and months. This collision has definitely exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on these reactive safety measures. And it's forcing us to ask, some tough questions about how we manage our airspace, especially in these, really densely populated areas.
Yeah. And what about the future? New technologies are emerging all the time. Things like those eVTOL aircraft, essentially flying cars.
Yeah.
How are those going to be integrated into our already very crowded airspace?
Yeah, the rise of eVTOLs and these other kind of novel aircraft designs, that's definitely going to, further complicate airspace management. We're going to need some really innovative solutions, perhaps even like a complete rethinking of how we regulate and control the skies.
Wow. A lot to ponder. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the specifics of the DCA collision,
Hmm.
to this sweeping history of those helicopter regulations, the crucial role of pilot responsibility, and all those challenges that lie ahead. And I think it's a stark reminder that aviation safety, it's a multi-layered, constantly evolving challenge. It demands vigilance from the regulators, from the pilots, and from even us, the passengers. So what does all of this mean for you, the listener?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is awareness. Just understanding the complexities of air travel, all those factors that contribute to safety, because it empowers you, I think, to be a more informed traveler. Don't just blindly trust that everything's going to be okay, because you have that boarding pass in your hand. Ask questions, stay informed about, potential risks, and make choices that prioritize safety.
And if something doesn't seem right, if something seems off, speak up. Whether it's, concern about weather conditions, or, a pilot's behavior, or even just like a gut feeling. Don't hesitate to voice those concerns.
Yeah, I think being an informed and engaged passenger, it's part of a collective responsibility for aviation safety. It's not just about the regulations or the pilots, it's about all of us, working together to make those skies as safe as possible.
Absolutely. And this incident raises some really serious questions about, air travel safety, the future of aviation. Like, are those emergency patches enough? Or do we need those really comprehensive long-term solutions? What questions does this tragedy raise for you about the future of aviation?